She was standing at the window of a $4 million penthouse, still in her wedding dress, when she found the folder. Not a folder on a desk, a folder on his laptop, open, glowing in the dark, titled in 2 words that would end everything she thought she knew. Project Elena. Inside were photos, dates, timelines, a plan that had started 3 years before he ever looked her in the eye and said, "I love you." The marriage wasn't an accident. It wasn't fate. It wasn't love. It was a weapon, aimed directly at her family. And she had walked right down the aisle and handed it to him. The question is, what do you do when you realize the man you married never intended to keep you, only destroy you? Elena Vasquez was 29 when she met Damian Hargrove at a charity gala in Manhattan. She was a rising architect with her own small firm. 5 years of 80-hour weeks, $60,000 in student loans still sitting on her name, and a reputation for turning abandoned buildings into something worth saving. She was the daughter of Marcos Vasquez, a man who had built a modest real estate development company in the Bronx over 30 years. Not rich, but respected. A man who had sacrificed his health to give Elena and her sister everything they needed. When Damian walked into her life, he seemed different from the other men at those galas. He listened. He asked questions. He remembered details. Her favorite street in Barcelona, the building that made her want to become an architect, her father's name. They dated for 14 months. He proposed on a rooftop she had designed herself. She said yes before he finished the sentence. The wedding was small, intimate, exactly what she wanted. Her father walked her down the aisle with tears in his eyes. And on the night she became Mrs. Hargrove. While her husband made excuses to take a call, Elena went looking for a phone charger. And then, everything changed. The folder contained a timeline, a detailed, color-coded timeline of Elena's life, going back 4 years. The neighborhoods she lived in, her firm's financial records, her father's company debts. There were notes in Damian's handwriting, observations, weaknesses, entry points. She told herself it was coincidence. She told herself there was an explanation. Then she found layer 2. She doesn't know yet. She won't know until we need her to. An email from Damian to his business attorney, sent 4 months before the wedding. 11 years ago, Damian's father had partnered with Marcos Vasquez on a development project in Queens. The deal collapsed. Damian's father, who had invested everything, lost $2.3 million and died of a heart attack 18 months later, at 54. Damian was 23, and he had spent every year since deciding it was Marcos Vasquez's fault. But the plan wasn't just to hurt Marcos. The plan, as Elena read it, hands shaking, was to use Elena to gain access to Marcos's remaining company assets, force a hostile acquisition through a conflict of interest clause embedded in their new joint holdings, and destroy the Vasquez name publicly in a fraud investigation that Damian had already begun planting evidence for. Elena was the key. She scrolled further. There was one more document, a prenuptial addendum, buried in the legal language she had signed 6 weeks before the wedding, trusting his lawyers, that gave Damian controlling rights over any joint business ventures initiated during the marriage, including the firm she had spent 5 years building, including a contract she had just signed 2 weeks ago with his property group. He hadn't just planned to destroy her father. He had planned to take her work, too. She closed the laptop. She sat down on the floor in her wedding dress. And for 43 minutes, Elena Vasquez said nothing at all. She had nothing, or so he thought. She could have screamed. She could have confronted him right then, thrown the laptop across the room, and made him explain himself while she sobbed into her wedding veil. Instead, she did something that would take Damien Hargrove completely apart over the next 90 days. She smiled. When he walked back into that room at 11:47 p.m., Elena looked up at him from the chair where she was sitting, and she said, "I was waiting for you. I don't want to waste another minute of tonight." He didn't notice that her hands had stopped shaking. He didn't notice that she had memorized every page. What Damien didn't know was that Elena had a law school roommate who was now one of New York's sharpest corporate attorneys. He didn't know that Elena had spent those 43 minutes on the floor not breaking down, but building a mental inventory of every document in that folder. He didn't know that she had already taken 4 photos on her phone before he re-entered the room. He had spent 3 years studying her weaknesses. He had missed the most important thing about her. Elena Vasquez did not fall apart. She renovated. She took damage and she turned it into structure. She had been doing it to buildings her whole career. Now she was going to do it to a man who thought he had already won. Within 72 hours of her wedding night, Elena had sent her attorney, Priya Chandran, every photograph from the folder. Within 96 hours, Priya had confirmed what Elena already knew. The prenuptial addendum was only valid if it had been signed with full informed consent. Elena had signed it while reviewing a 43-page document in a 20-minute window without independent legal counsel, a direct violation of New York contract law. The addendum was void, but Elena didn't file anything, not yet. She kept playing the role of the devoted new wife. She attended his dinners. She smiled at his colleagues. She let him believe that the plan was on schedule. Meanwhile, she was building a file of her own. Over the next 4 weeks, she documented 17 instances of Damien discussing the fraud operation. In texts, in voicemails he left at his office, in a dinner conversation she recorded after consulting with Priya about the legality of doing so in a state where one-party consent applies. She gathered the names of 2 former business associates Damien had similarly leveraged in the past, one of whom was willing to speak. But that was just the beginning. On day 61 of her marriage, while Damien was preparing for a $90 million commercial real estate announcement, his biggest deal of the year, one that required a pristine public reputation, Elena's attorney filed a civil complaint in Manhattan Supreme Court. The complaint alleged fraudulent inducement of marriage, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and an attempted conspiracy to commit securities fraud using forged conflict of interest documentation connected to Marcos Vasquez's company. It was filed at 9:14 a.m. By 10:30 a.m., it had been picked up by 3 financial news outlets. By noon, the press conference Damien had scheduled at 2 p.m. was canceled. His business partner, a man who had no idea about the personal nature of Damien's scheme, withdrew from the $90 million deal by 4 p.m. that afternoon, citing concerns about reputational exposure. Damien called Elena 7 times in 2 hours. She didn't answer once, but that was just the beginning. The divorce was finalized 4 months later. Because the prenuptial addendum had been invalidated, Elena retained full ownership of her firm. The joint venture contract was dissolved. She walked away with her business, her name, and a $340,000 settlement for emotional damages, awarded by a judge who described Damien's conduct as a calculated and premeditated abuse of a personal relationship for financial gain. Damien's fraud investigation triggered by Elena's documentation and the testimony of his former associate, resulted in a separate civil suit from the SEC. He was barred from serving as an officer or director of any publicly traded company for 7 years. His most important backer, a private equity group that had anchored 3 of his developments, terminated their relationship in writing, citing irreparable reputational damage. The man who had spent 11 years building a plan to destroy the Vasquez family had, in 90 days, dismantled the empire he built in its place. Here is where they were when it started. Damien had a $200 million portfolio, a pristine reputation, and a bride who trusted him completely. Here is where they stood when it ended. Elena had her firm, growing, debt-free, and with a new government contract worth $1.2 million. Her father kept his company, and Damien Hargrove had a 7-year regulatory ban, 2 active lawsuits, and a reputation that no press team in Manhattan would touch. He had built his plan on the assumption that Elena was a door. She turned out to be the architect. Here is the lesson Elena never said out loud, but lived completely. The most dangerous person in any room is the one who knows exactly what you did, says nothing, and prepares everything. Now I want to know what you think. Did Elena go too far or not far enough? Drop your verdict in the comments below. I've seen this debate split people right down the middle, and I want to hear where you land. Next week, we have a story about a man who spent 12 years mentoring his company's rising star, only to discover that Star had been stealing his ideas and building a competing firm in secret. What he found in that person's office on the last day will change how you think about loyalty forever. If you're not subscribed yet, do it now. Stories like these drop every week, and you do not want to miss what's coming.